A man unwittingly falls into the clutches of a ruthless Mexican drug cartel. Without a word, the gang brutally murders all of his colleagues, but the main character finds himself an exception. The Mexican cartel spares him because he promises to help them launder $500 million within 5 years. Little does he know, this decision puts his family in grave danger. They are forced to leave their home and move to a strange new land, only to discover it's filled with dangerous criminals who are also controlled by the Mexican cartel. If the main character fails to keep his promise, his wife and children will be eliminated on the spot. So, how will the main character manage to launder $500 million in 5 years without catching the attention of the IRS? The main character, Marty, is a financial business advisor with his own firm based in Chicago. He has a beautiful wife, a rebellious teenage daughter, and an obedient young son. That day, while Marty is advising a client on financial matters, he unexpectedly receives a video showing his wife being intimate with another man. This revelation leaves Marty unable to feel any joy, yet he chooses not to confront his wife. Instead, Marty hires escorts to try to distract himself from his sadness. As if this misfortune weren't enough, another disaster strikes. His superior calls him in, summoning all his colleagues to gather at the company for an urgent meeting. The man in charge is Marco, a senior associate of the second largest drug cartel in Mexico. It's revealed that in 2007, Marty and his best friend, who is also his business partner, secretly collaborated with Marco to launder money for the cartel. Unexpectedly, Marco announces that $8 million have been stolen from him. Hearing this, Marty becomes visibly angry. They have been cooperating for the past 10 years, yet now they begin to suspect each other. Before anyone could grasp what was happening, Marco shot the wife of the best friend dead. As the gunshots rang out, the father and son of the shipping company couldn't stop blaming Marty's best friend for being the thief. Thus, they were all escorted down to the basement. The body of the wife was thrown into a vat of acid. Before they could come to terms with what was happening, Marco shot the father and son of the shipping company dead. Marty's partner, realizing that he was next in line, confessed to the crime and assured that Marty had nothing to do with it. Witnessing his friend getting killed right in front of him left Marty in shock, but to save his own life, Marty quickly fabricated a story about a place where money laundering is extremely safe, a haven called Ozark. He mentioned that the area is always bustling with people, but the management is lenient. Marty confidently claimed that he could launder $500 million there within 5 years. To his surprise, his story worked. Marco was partly convinced by his tale. He decided to spare Marty's life for the time being but demanded that Marty retrieve the $8 million and the colleagues who had stolen from the cartel. Left with no other option, Marty had to agree to the demand. Knowing his wife was frightened and wanted to call the police, Marty stopped her directly, fearing it would endanger their family. Instead, he proposed selling their house and moving to Ozark with their family. However, his wife refused to leave just like that. Under the advice of her old lawyer, who was also her lover, Wendy stole Marty's checks, deciding to leave him and run away with their children and the money. As for Marty, to gather $8 million, he sold all his personal assets and closed all of his company's accounts. Soon after, he received news from the bank that his wife had withdrawn all his money. Enraged, Marty headed to confront the old lawyer, but when he arrived, the man had already been thrown off a building. Marty was taken aback. It turned out Marco had realized Wendy's intentions due to her affair and her theft of Marty's money, so he asked Marty to make a choice: forgive his wife or allow them to execute her right there. After much thought, remembering she was still the mother of his children, Marty chose to forgive her and even told Wendy not to be too hard on herself. The next day, Marty went to the bank to withdraw cash, but the police stopped him, doubting the money was for legitimate business. However, Marty cleverly argued, claiming he needed the cash to fill his bathtub, threatening to report them for withholding his money. His bold statements worked, and he was able to leave with the cash. He then brought the $8 million to Marco. Surprisingly, Marco refused to take it. Instead, he wanted Marty to take the money to Ozark to verify whether Marty's previous claims were true. With no choice left, Marty's family packed their belongings and moved to the Ozark. Despite this, Marty was filled with remorse, constantly blaming himself for putting his family in danger. Upon arriving, they rented a local hotel. Their first task was to find a place to live and a job, so Marty instructed his children to watch their belongings carefully while he and his wife went out to handle business. In the car, his wife couldn't stop complaining about the old lawyer's murder by Marco, which irritated Marty greatly. He retorted that ever since the lawyer died, he'd had the best sleep, making Wendy furious. She punched his jaw, and their relationship became even more strained. To launder the $8 million for the Mexican cartel, Marty began looking for local businesses and offered to invest in their stores. Meanwhile, Wendy went around town searching for a rental house. She quickly found a suitable apartment that was beautiful and affordable, but the landlord had one condition. The landlord was terminally ill and didn't have long to live. Before he passed away, he wished to spend the rest of his life in the apartment, with Wendy's family living upstairs while he stayed in the basement. After some hesitation, Wendy agreed. On the other hand, after being told by their parents to watch over the belongings, the teenage daughter became bored. Just then, a handsome young boy approached and struck up a conversation, inviting Charlotte to go surfing. So, Charlotte left her little brother alone with their belongings and went out to the sea for fresh air. As a result, her brother couldn't stay put either, so he grabbed his MacBook, put on his backpack, and went exploring. After wandering around, Ronald befriended a local guy who gifted him a ceremonial knife as a keepsake. At the same time, Charlotte was out enjoying the breeze with her boyfriend John when the Coast Guard started chasing them. John had stolen the boat to stall the police and had thrown Charlotte into the sea. She was rescued and brought to the station, where Marty and his wife arrived to bail her out. However, the chief of police demanded compensation for the stolen boat. Marty was perplexed as to why they weren't pursuing the person who almost killed his daughter and were instead demanding money from them. The chief explained that he only helped taxpayers. Upon hearing this, Marty and his wife pointed out that they were taxpayers and were putting down a deposit on a house. Seeing this, the chief of police changed his stance and informed them that John and his accomplice had thrown Charlotte off the boat. The suspects were part of a local criminal family, the Landnotes, but the chief reassured them that there was no immediate danger. His real concern was the cousin of the two suspects, a notorious thief in the criminal community named Ruby. Hearing this, Marty rushed back to the hotel, only to find that the $8 million had disappeared. The thief was Ruby. Just when things seemed hopeless, Charlotte revealed that she knew Ruby's whereabouts. With the address in hand, Marty quickly crossed the river with 2 suitcases. He located their hideout and discovered that the Landnote family had targeted his money for a long time, planning to distract his daughter while they stole it. After waiting for the son to leave, Ruby had broken in to steal the money. Marty stormed into their hideout. Despite their aggression and threats with knives, Marty was undeterred, knowing that if they spent the money, the tax authorities would take notice. He even revealed that the money belonged to the Mexican drug cartel. Hearing this, the thieves were immediately frightened. Marty warned them that if they killed or robbed anyone here, the Mexican cartel would annihilate their entire family. If they wanted the money, they would have to go through him. Clearly, Marty had the upper hand. As expected, the Landnote family abandoned their plans. However, they still asked for a small sum of $20,000 for breakfast. With their plan ruined, Ruby was extremely frustrated. Nevertheless, Marty successfully retrieved the money. Meanwhile, after Marco killed Maddie's colleagues and disposed of their bodies in acid, the police quickly discovered the scene. Although the bodies were decomposed, they identified the victims through the remaining body parts. After the massacre, Marty had sold all his assets and moved his family to Ozark before the move. Marty went to the bank to withdraw a large sum of money, which raised suspicions among the police. They decided to go to Ozark to question him about the Mexican drug cartel. Meanwhile, after finding a house, Maddie's wife and family moved their belongings there. However, their daughter continuously complained and questioned why they had moved. Unable to hide the truth any longer, Wendy eventually told the children the reality of their situation.
The landlord of their new home was quite peculiar, even wandering around naked in the yard. Nevertheless, after learning the truth from their mother, their son began investigating the Mexican drug cartel. Meanwhile, Wendy, after a few days of job hunting, met a man named Sam, who owned a real estate agency. She quickly found work with him as his assistant. Despite days of exploring local investment opportunities, Marty had yet to find a suitable place. However, he targeted a business called the Green Cat, which ran a motel and bar but was currently closed. The reason was that the owner had defaulted on a bank loan, and the property was mortgaged. Marty proposed investing in the Green Cat, and it soon reopened. At this time, Ruby came to see Marty because she had been fired from her job at the hotel for stealing from him and demanded that he find her another job. Marty refused outright, pointing out that her family had previously tried to kill him and now she was asking for a favor. Ruby threatened to expose the $8 million, leaving Marty with no choice but to offer her a dishwashing job at the Green Cat. Meanwhile, Maddie's daughter, Charlotte, was interviewing for jobs when she encountered the 2 Landnote brothers who had thrown her into the sea. To retaliate, she punched John directly. Marty was pleased with his daughter's actions. The next morning, an animal carcass was thrown in front of Maddie's house just as an FBI agent arrived. The agent revealed that Maddie's late friend had been providing information against the Mexican drug cartel to the FBI and hinted that Marty should cease his illegal activities. Despite this, Marty deflected and claimed ignorance of the situation. Agent ROI also arrived in Ozark and began monitoring Maddie's family. Concurrently, the Landnote brothers came to Maddie's house and provocatively taunted him and his wife, likely fueled by John's anger from the earlier encounter with Charlotte. The next day, another animal carcass appeared on Maddie's lawn. Unable to tolerate it any longer, Wendy threw the carcass back at John, warning him that if they came to her house again, there would be consequences. To continue laundering money, Marty gathered information about the Chinsu Club, a failing strip club. Marty had previously offered to invest in Chinsu, but the owner had outright refused, knowing that Marty wanted to launder money. Undeterred, Marty decided to take control of the place for his laundering activities. He enlisted Ruby to help him break into the owner's office and retrieve something important from the safe, promising her a 25% share of whatever they found. Meanwhile, Agent ROI had infiltrated the Green Cat and spotted Ruby with Marty. After investigating her background, the lieutenant began paying closer attention to one member of Maddie's family. The person in question is Danmode, the father of the two troublemaking kids. Thus, Agent ROI approached and befriended him, even inviting him for a fishing trip. Meanwhile, Ruby, having been hired by Marty, applied for a job at the Chinsu Club. However, the bald owner was extremely lewd and required Ruby to pass a test before being hired. Ruby responded by punching him in the groin. Despite this, Ruby managed to identify the location of the safe. At the same time, Maddie's son discovered the carcass of a wolf. Ronald dragged it home and began dissecting it. His parents were shocked, but upon learning that he was studying the vulture's diet as their scavengers, they were somewhat relieved. Ruby then used $2,000 from Marty to bribe a group of bald youths to engage in lewd activities with the dancers at Chinsu Club. Subsequently, Ruby alerted the police, leading to the owner of the club being arrested for pimping and endangering minors. Seizing the opportunity, Ruby attempted to open the safe in the club's office. However, she struggled to unlock it, so Marty brought the safe home. Upon opening it, Ruby was greatly disappointed to find no gold or valuables, only worthless Chinsu Club stock certificates. The next day, Marty visited the bald owner in jail and unexpectedly posted his bail, offering to buy the Chinsu Club for $200,000. The bald owner refused. Nevertheless, Marty used the confidential information from the safe to force him to sell the club. Unable to refuse, the bald owner complied. After acquiring the Chinsu Club, Marty paid Ruby $7,000 as her share. Following his release, the bald owner went straight to meet his superior, Luxon, the local drug lord. The bald owner informed Luxon of Maddie's presence, but Luxon did not respond. At that moment, Luxon's wife took the opportunity to inject him with a syringe, causing him to convulse and foam at the mouth. It turned out that Luxon killed him because he had lost the Chinsu Club, which was used to launder money for his flour business. Meanwhile, Marty taught his son how to launder money. For example, if you find $5 million on the street, you might think of buying something big, but the IRS won't let you spend it so easily. Therefore, you should deposit the money in the bank, but if the money is too clean, like it was just withdrawn from the bank, you need to make it appear older. Next, you need a cash-based business. After earning from this business, mix the $5 million with the business earnings. Then, open a new account overseas. And there you have it, your money is clean. The next day, Marty and his wife were horrified to find the bald owner's body left at their dock. The police quickly removed the body, concluding that it was an accident. However, the sheriff suspected Marty of being the perpetrator because they had previously discussed the purchase of the Chinsu Club. He asked Marty to bring the purchase documents to the station for verification. Later, Marty unexpectedly encountered Luxon, the drug lord. Luxon wanted Marty to continue laundering money for him as a replacement for the bald owner, with whom Luxon had previously made lucrative deals. Marty, however, flatly refused. When Marty visited Chinsu Club, he was met with suspicious glances from everyone, as they suspected him of being involved in the former owner's death. Concerned about the potential impact on his business, Marty asked Ruby to manage Chinsu Club for a while. Meanwhile, Marty went to work at the Green Cat Bar, but the bar owner advised him to stay away temporarily for the good of the business. At the same time, Maddie's son went down to the basement, which was now the landlord's room, and discovered a large stash of weapons. The two of them decided to practice shooting together. Despite his youth and inexperience, Ronald quickly became proficient with a few theoretical lessons. The next day, Marty brought a copy of the Chinsu Club's sale documents to the sheriff. This cleared him of suspicion. The sheriff also revealed that the bald owner had died from a heroin overdose. However, the sheriff had been bribed by Luxon, who still needed to launder another $4 million.
Buying property alone wouldn't suffice, they needed a large-scale project. So, Marty and his wife sought out a legitimate pastor who frequently held Sunday services on a boat. Marty pretended to be a philanthropist, offering to fund the construction of a church in Ozark. This would provide an opportunity to launder money for the Mexican cartel, and the pastor and his congregation wouldn't have to hold services on the lake anymore.
Meanwhile, Ruby improved her management of Chinsu Club, hiring new staff and attracting more customers. The club became a money-making machine. Marty left Ruby in charge of Chinsu Club completely. However, while Marty was storing money, Ruby followed him. In parallel, after many fishing trips with Danmote, Lieutenant Roy developed feelings for him. Roy was actually gay. The black agent was Roy's former lover, and Roy's attempt to kiss Danmote made him uncomfortable, leading to a violent altercation. That evening, Danmote went to Roy's house and forcibly kissed him. It turned out they were kindred spirits. The next morning, while Marty was out for his morning bike ride, a pickup truck suddenly blocked his way and forcibly took him away. By the time his wife arrived, it was too late. It turned out that Marty had been taken by Luxon's gang. Luxon was furious with Marty for taking over Chinsu Club, the gang's primary money laundering venue, and for disrupting their flower distribution network. Luxon revealed that during the pastor's boat services, all the heroin was hidden in hymnals. Luxon's men would then distribute it to street-level dealers, all of whom were part of the pastor's congregation. If the church were built, these services WOU.
Luxon threatened Marty, saying if he continued to invest in the church, he would kill Maddie's wife. Luxon even disclosed Maddie's home address as part of the threat. After making his threats, Luxon's gang released Marty back to his family. Nevertheless, the protagonist immediately went to find the pastor. He used the excuse of delaying the church construction and wanted the pastor to continue preaching on the water. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Roy invited Danmote to start a fishing gear business, but since there was no investment capital, the lieutenant suggested asking the protagonist to invest. Clearly, Marty was investing in many businesses in Ozark. Knowing that Danmote's niece was doing business with Marty, Lieutenant Roy wanted him to persuade his niece. At the same time, the protagonist received a package from the Mexican cartel. It contained the eyes of a dead person. Clearly, they sent this as a reminder for Marty to quickly accelerate the money laundering process. Ruby visited the prison to see her father. Since Maddie's money was depleting, he wanted his daughter to act immediately. Thus, Ruby started setting up traps at the protagonist's dock, and the situation became increasingly tense. She also informed her uncle about this. Realizing this, he told Lieutenant Roy. Later, Ruby volunteered to drive the protagonist to handle the issue. However, when they arrived at the protagonist's dock, he walked calmly and was not electrocuted. It turned out that the person who had disabled the traps was Lieutenant Roy. Seeing an intruder in the yard, the protagonist's son immediately grabbed a weapon to threaten him. This made the lieutenant surrender. Realizing that the plan had failed, Ruby immediately confronted her uncle, accusing Danmote of disabling the traps at the dock. This made Danmote furious, as he hadn't done anything. Meanwhile, after checking the bills, the owner of the Mio Sun bar discovered that there were excessive expenditures and investments related to drugs. Therefore, she suspected that the protagonist was involved in illegal activities. With no other choice, the protagonist had to reveal the whole truth and asked her to cover for him this time, but clearly, no one could cover for him in such illegal activities. Soon after, the protagonist discovered that a cross had been erected as a replacement. He rushed to the pastor's house. Coincidentally, the couple of the crime boss Luxon was also coming here to resolve the current situation. The protagonist said he would no longer invest in the church but would invest in Luxon's farm. However, in the absence of the pastor, the protagonist gave him $700,000 in cash to prevent Luxon from executing him. In France, the pastor, after discovering that Lieutenant Roy was the one stopping his niece from killing the protagonist, was surprised, but the lieutenant explained that to provide them with what they needed, the protagonist had to stay alive. He even wanted Danmote to promise not to kill Marty. After agreeing, Roy rewarded him with a passionate kiss. Meanwhile, a customer came to look at real estate, and the protagonist's wife enthusiastically showed him several properties. The man was very strange because he knew the names of her entire family. It turned out he was from the Mexican cartel. He came here to demand that Marty speed up the money laundering process. Since the money had already been taken by Luxon, and knowing that Sam's mother was about to retire, the wife persuaded Sam to abandon his mother and invest the money in an investment fund. This was a fund recently set up by her and Marty, essentially to convert the money into cash for the Mexican cartel. Even the protagonist went to persuade Sam's mother. He spoke about the benefits of investing in the fund and charmed her quickly. Marty won the favor of Sam's mother, so she decided to invest the money in the fund. Because the pastor refused to stop the church construction, the protagonist decided to tell him the truth that Luxon was actually the drug lord. He was using the pastor's sermons to distribute drugs through the hymnals. The pastor was shocked, but Marty still urged him to continue holding services. Otherwise, the Luxon gang would come after their family. But in the name of the Savior, the pastor swore he would not cooperate with them. Although the protagonist's wife strongly advised them to leave the city, the pastor remained resolute and went to confront Luxon, exposing his villainous nature. He even said he would not report to the police unless they allowed him to build the church. Luxon also revealed that the protagonist's plan to build the church was for money laundering, claiming that no one involved was clean. Hearing this, the pastor brought gasoline to the construction site and set it ablaze. Meanwhile, Ruby visited her father in prison, but since the plan to trap the protagonist had failed, her father was displeased. He told his daughter not to return unless Marty was dead. On Sam's side, continuously scolded by his mother as a useless son, he fired his mother from the company. This led to a bitter argument between them, and while his mother was standing on the road, she was accidentally hit by a truck. At this time, realizing that a member of the Mexican cartel was following his father, the son asked the new acquaintance to buy a rifle for Marty. After discovering that the church construction had been burned down, the protagonist suspected Luxon was behind it. Luxon confirmed that he had revealed everything about the protagonist to the pastor. Lieutenant Roy exposed Dan Mote's identity to his partner, presenting evidence that Dan Mote was plotting murder. Roy used this to blackmail Dan Mote, demanding he persuade his niece Ruby to side with the federal authorities against the protagonist. Soon after, Dan Mote returned to meet his niece. He asked if she still intended to kill Marty, but after being punched by Dan Mote the previous day, Ruby only gave a light laugh.
It turned out Dan Mote was trying to lure Ruby into revealing her plan to kill the protagonist, which would provide the FBI with evidence to force her cooperation. However, despite Dan Mote's probing, Ruby consistently claimed she had no intention of killing the protagonist. Ruby realized her uncle had been trapped and knew she was cornered. Dan Mote also informed his younger brother that he had been trapped by the FBI and proposed a plan to kill Marty and steal his money. The younger brother was very surprised but agreed to join the plan since they had been playing together since childhood. The next day, Dan Mote instructed his two sons that tonight would be their biggest heist and then they would move to Berlin to live, but they would leave without Ruby. After the mother was hit, she sadly passed away, so Sam wanted to withdraw the money from the investment fund to hold a grand funeral for her. Fearing he would not have money to pay the Mexican cartel, Marty volunteered to cover the costs of Sam's mother's funeral and minimized all expenses as much as possible. Ultimately, Marty managed to launder $8 million by the deadline set by the Mexican cartel. Meanwhile, the son was outside when members of the Mexican cartel signaled a warning to him in case of emergencies. Ronald had practiced shooting on the mountain before. He quickly hid the goods in a spot, but when he left, the landlord came and removed all the ammunition. At the same time, when Ruby returned home, she found her uncles missing. Despite being warned by her father, John told his sister the truth.
Ruby was not allowed to leave with the family. John emotionally hugged his sister one last time. From this point, Ruby understood her uncle Dan Mote's intentions. Although he had laundered $8 million by the deadline, the Mexican cartel imposed a new challenge. Marty had to launder $50 million this time. Because the amount of cash was so large, the protagonist's family had to work together to wrap the money and store it behind a partition in the Mio Sun Bar. At that moment, Dan Mote and his younger brother arrived at the protagonist's dock. They decided to kill and rob the protagonist that night, but as they touched the stairs, Dan Mote was suddenly electrocuted. The younger brother, in a panic, tried to pull his brother out, but no one could save him from the electrocution. By the time the protagonist arrived, both brothers were dead. After examining the scene, they realized it was a setup. After some contemplation, the protagonist recognized that Ruby had set the trap because she had passed by his house a few hours earlier. Soon after, Ruby admitted to the protagonist that she couldn't let them kill him. Knowing this, Marty comforted her. Upon hearing about Dan Mote's death, Lieutenant Roy was furious. The next day, Marty also went to express his condolences to the Landno family, but Ronald remained suspicious of the protagonist for killing his father. To prevent Luxon from harming his family, the pastor reluctantly continued the mourning services, but his conscience could no longer allow him to commit illegal activities in front of God. Therefore, the pastor decided to cancel the sermon and went to see Luxon. However, instead of expressing anger as usual, Luxon said that from now on, the pastor was free to do as he wished. Yet when the pastor returned home, he found his wife missing and discovered a newborn baby instead. Could it be that Luxon had killed the protagonist's wife and informed him about it? The pastor realized that this land was too dangerous, so Marty wanted to take his wife and children to escape, while he stayed behind to face the situation. If he left, the Mexican cartel would surely hunt him down. Knowing this, Wendy hurriedly asked the children to pack their belongings. Marty immediately went to see the crime boss Luxon. Since the pastor would no longer hold services, Luxon would lose his distribution network, so Marty said he would be Luxon's only customer and offered to buy all the flour in the warehouse and even take on the money laundering for him. After some hesitation, Luxon agreed and accepted the money. At the same time, Wendy and the children planned to leave Ozark, but suddenly, a member of the Mexican cartel, the assassin Necrot, arrived to stop them. However, the son also grabbed a firearm, ready to go all out against the opponent. Unfortunately, his gun was without ammunition. Clearly, the landlord had removed all the bullets. Taking the opportunity, Necrot intended to teach the boy a lesson, but the landlord appeared with a gun. He ordered Wendy and her children to get into the car and escape, while he stayed behind to confront the assassin. By the time the protagonist arrived home, Necrot had already been killed. Realizing the situation was dire and to prevent the Mexican cartel from discovering the truth, Marty and the landlord burnt the body. At this moment, at the Mio Sun bar, the bar owner discovered the money hidden in the wall by the protagonist family. She quickly packed some of it into a bag, and as she was leaving, she ran into Marco, a senior member of the Mexican cartel, who failed to recognize anything and allowed her to leave. Marco's departure was observed by Lieutenant Roy, who immediately recorded his license plate. However, they couldn't arrest Marco because he had a clean record, and the cartel used him as a go-between. Thus, they had to find a way to make Marty betray the cartel. If they had the protagonist in their control, Marco would certainly feel uneasy. After stealing Maddie's money, the bar owner immediately left Ozark. At this point, the protagonist had sent a meeting point to his wife and lied that the family would reunite there. However, when Wendy and the children arrived, they only found a private investigator waiting. He handed them passports and fake identity documents, instructing them to avoid revealing their identities to prevent the Mexican cartel from tracking them. On the other hand, after Danmode and his brother's deaths reached Ruby's father, he called to verify whether the protagonist was dead, but his daughter said he was still alive. Realizing this, he quickly ended the call. Since she had set up the trap that led to John's father's death, Charlotte felt some guilt. Ruby registered to be the guardian and decided to stay with the two boys for life. Meanwhile, Marco arrived at the protagonist's place. He and the Mexican cartel immediately restrained him. Marco wanted to know which precinct Necrot was from. It was clear that Necrot had been cremated. Seeing Maddie's reluctance to cooperate, Marcy aggressively had his men pull out Maddie's toenails, causing Marty to scream in pain. To resolve this urgent situation, the protagonist convinced Marco to stop, claiming he had a plan. At this time, the black agent brought the documents to the police chief. Representing the Mexican government, he wanted to extradite Marco through his license plate. They also discovered Marco's vehicle was with Luxon, so they decided to set a trap to catch him. Meanwhile, the protagonist led the Mexican cartel to meet Luxon and proposed a plan that would benefit both parties. Since Luxon lacked a distribution network for flour, Marty suggested that the Mexican cartel buy all their goods. Buying from Ozark would reduce risks for the Mexican cartel. However, Marco refused to cooperate. Knowing this, Marty proposed a second plan. He wanted to open a casino on Luxon's territory, which was part of the Mitsubishi River area, where state law allowed casino construction. This would not only generate enormous profits but also handle money laundering issues. Clearly, this was a lucrative opportunity. Indeed, this proposal attracted both parties, and Luxon and Marco decided to cooperate. But during their conversation, Marco made racist comments about Luxon. As a result, Luxon's wife killed Marco. Seeing this, Marty was stunned and criticized her, knowing that Marco's death would surely bring more trouble from the cartel. Luxon, however, advised Marty not to worry and to go home and rest. They would handle the mess themselves. However, as soon as the protagonist stepped out, he was surrounded by the police. It was Marty, not Marco, who was on the ground. Lieutenant Roy and the Black Loop. Meanwhile, after days of being unable to contact her husband, Wendy called the landlord. He recounted everything Marty was going through. Knowing her husband was in danger, Wendy brought the children back to Ozark. They decided to stay and face the risks rather than flee without Marty. Will Marty face further challenges from the Mexican cartel after Marco's death, and how will he manage to launder $50 million in the near future? The answers will be revealed in the next season. This concludes Season 1 of Ozark. Thank you for watching the video. Goodbye and see you in the next video.